So there's a proliferation of violence amongst our young people. It's nothing new, really. At my age right now, I remember very clearly the fights, the wars, the battles that happened amongst young people, amongst my cohort of young people. And now, as an elder statesman in my community, I see the same thing this generation. And you have to ask yourself, at least I do ask myself, why? What is it exactly that has kept that energy alive across decades? Because when I research, at least from the perspective of the neighborhoods that I grew up in Los Angeles, going back to the 60s and 70s and 60s, and even before that, that energy was still there. But that energy was tied into oppression, was tied into the racial unjust laws that existed. They kept one people subjugated to another, and its youth screaming for air to breathe. But here we are now, 2022, and our children are still fighting. But they're not fighting the system. They're not fighting against a way of life that is subjugating them, but rather they're fighting each other. And I'm trying to understand, what is it? What is the cause of these acts of violence towards one another? And we're not talking about Bloods and Crips. We're not talking about gangs going back and forth because of territory. I'm talking about children just going after each other. So this is my question. How much of it has to do with children just being children, but rather how much of it has to do with trauma? How much how much does trauma play into this behavior? And that's a question that I've been pondering upon. The other day, somebody sent me a video of a fight happening in the streets. And we're talking about multiple children, dozens, in the streets, New York City, just throwing hands, And what was interesting, that 90% of the children who were fighting were girls. And it looked like I was watching something out of a battlefield. The level of just vicious blows that they were throwing at each other, connecting, hurting each other, made me sick to my stomach. And I have to ask myself, what is it that would cause this level of rage and anger, and maybe even hate? Whether it's hate for the other person or hate for self. What is it? My conclusion is that it has to be trauma. But these kids are coming from places that are unsafe, places where you have to watch yourself, watch your back all the time. You can't trust. Being a child, just the whole notion of going outside and laughing and running around and having a good time was taken away from them long ago. And for a lot of them, majority of them, they never even had it. Then the pain of loss, incomplete families, incomplete households, whether it's economically, whether it's just even having a place to stay, food to eat, clothes on your back. Love, being genuinely loved and taken care of and being protected. Those things are not there, at least not fully. And as a result, our children are trying to find a way to feel something other than fear and loss. One thing I learned a long time ago when I had puppies, and please don't think I'm comparing our children to dogs, but I'm talking about behavior. I remember having a dog who was misbehaving. And I got so angry that my energy in approaching the dog was so swift because I wanted to get the dog outside because the dog had made a mess. But my energy by itself caused the dog to corner itself and bark at me with this level of just rage. But it wasn't rage, it was fear. Because my big self approaching the puppy, that puppy at that moment in time probably felt that some harm was coming to them and reacted as it did. And I just remember jumping back thinking, oh my God, wait a minute, what just happened here? But I realized that moment of fear and feeling unloved and maybe possibly some harm coming to itself sparked rage and a certain level of violence. How many of our children feel that way? They feel cornered, they feel unsafe, and they feel like the only way they can take back any kind of sense of self is to lash out. As a school leader, as a human being working with children, we gotta do better in finding ways to really sit down and understand what our kids are going through. Our guidance counselors and social workers are not equipped by any means to address these issues. We need trauma specialists. We need therapists. We need people who are going to come into our schools and engage in deep conversations, deep work with not just the kids, but their families. And it's going to be daunting. But we're talking about hundreds of children who are living in situations that are akin to a concentration camp. Have you been to the projects? Have you been to some of our neighborhoods where our kids literally feel, or even not even our kids, but the environment feels as though it's a prison? We know what happens when babies are born in prisons and if they're raised in prisons. What's the difference when we talk about communities like projects? So it's very important that we think about this. What are we going to do for our kids? What are you going to do for your kids in your school? This is deep. This is heavy. All right, y'all. Be well. Peace.